Well, hello, everybody. Good to see you. Want to welcome our campuses, whether you're watching us in Kenosha, Racine, online. No matter where you're at in the world, we love you, and we're glad you're a part of Great Lakes Church, or you find value in what we do. And, of course, we welcome the people in the room with me right now. Ladies and gentlemen, here's the deal. When you came in, there should have been, if you're in one of our physical locations, should have been 2 Christmas Eve invite cards or Christmas service invite cards on your chair. We should never call it Christmas Eve because we do Christmas a little bit unique. We don't actually celebrate on the 24th or the 25th because we kind of know Jesus wasn't actually born on the 25th. And so for us, our Christmas services, believe it or not, 1 week away. All right? So on Wednesday, December 18th, we have a 6 o'clock service and a 7:15. You have to choose, but don't just come alone, bring someone with you. And then on Sunday, December 22nd, we have a 9 a.m., 11 a.m., 5 p.m., and a 6:30 p.m. Are you ready? That was the lamest. I mean, if I'm trying to build some hype for Christmas, we have a pathetic amount of excitement. So are you ready? All right. Your big job's to invite. I promise you, we've gone through the preparations, the work, the prayers to really get ready for presenting the story of Christmas in a very creative, in a very hopefully powerful way. Now, today we're in week 2 of this series called Christmas Playlist. And what we're doing in this series is we're just looking at some popular Christmas songs, and then we're using them as a starting point for our talks. All right? And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start out by showing you a picture. But before I do, I just need to let you know, I don't want anybody to yell out any answers. All right? What I want to do is I want to show you a picture, and I want to ask you, how many of you genuinely, no questions asked, you know what this is a picture of, all right? So here we go. Again, don't shout it out. If you know what it is, put your hand up. So we got, at our weekends on Wednesday, there's about 7 people. Okay, you could go ahead and take it down, right? That is a picture of a dessert that we sing about every single year. All right? It goes like this. We wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Good tidings to you and all of your kin. We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Now, growing up, I probably sang that song 100 times before I knew that there was more to the song. Because this song that starts out very, very friendly, this Christmas greeting, we wish you a Merry Christmas, it quickly turns into very bratty and very demanding. It goes like this. Oh, bring us some figgy pudding. Oh, bring us some figgy pudding. Oh, bring us some figgy pudding and bring it right here. Oh, we're not done. We won't go until we get some. We won't go until we get some. We won't go until we get some. So bring it right here. So this is a song really about a bad house guest who has poor social skills. Can you imagine just showing up? Give me some figgy pudding. I'm not leaving till I get it, right? Now, as many times as I participated in singing this song or hearing others sing this song, I never knew, I didn't have a clue what figgy pudding was or what it looked like. But what does it look like? It looks like this. This is figgy pudding. And if you're interested in it, let me just tell you, you will be happy to know NPR put out an article about it. Debbie Woe, who apparently is a figgy pudding expert, she describes figgy pudding this way in her article. She says, it resembles something like a cannonball. And it feels a bit like a cannonball when it hits your stomach. But it's tradition, and we love it. All right? And then she goes on to say it's this old British tradition to eat it at Christmas time. And she explains. She says the classic figgy pudding dish has 13 ingredients. Now get this, representing Christ and the 12 apostles. Oh, we have gone to an all-no low, right? She says they put usually a little bit of holly on top, which stands for the crown of thorns. I am not making this stuff up. And of course, she says the most important part of the Christmas pudding tradition is we pour a bit of brandy over it and set it aflame to great applause. Woo! I do not even know what to say. Right, but we sing about this, and vast majority of us, whether it's online, campuses, or in the room I'm speaking, we didn't even know what figgy pudding looked like. And during this season, it is our tendency to read all types of stories, sing all types of songs, watch all kinds of movies without really giving them much thought. And this is especially true when it comes to the Christmas story. And so today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus in on a section of verses that I'm guessing you've either ignored, you've overlooked, or you have completely missed the significance of, and that's if you've even read them. Because most of us have not even read these verses. And before we do that, I need to remind you of how the Bible's put together. Otherwise, this can get really, really confusing, right? The Bible's not a book. The Bible's actually a library of books. It's a collection of books. It's 66 different manuscripts written about, over a period of about 1,500 years, different continents, different languages. And so you've got 66 different manuscripts. 4 of those manuscripts give us in pretty good detail the life and the teachings of Jesus. Those books are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So they give us the details of Jesus and his life and his birth. Actually, they don't all talk about the birth of Jesus. Mark and John don't mention the birth of Jesus, really. They start their books about 30 years into the life of Jesus. So all we have is Matthew and Luke. They do write about the birth of Jesus. Now, Luke, when he writes about the birth of Jesus and he kicks off his book, he starts with a very dramatic story. He talks about an angel showing up and announcing the birth of Jesus. Now, if you want to get your readers' attention, then you talk about an angel showing up and announcing the birth of Jesus. It's pretty dramatic. I'm guessing you would agree, right? So he knows how to start a book. It's a great opening. In fact, let me give you some ideas of what a great opening looks like, just so we're all on the same page here. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. Anybody know? Anybody know what book? Are you kidding? This may be the most disappointing start we've ever had to a talk, right? A Tale of Two Cities. All right, good. Oh, good. We got something down here. A Tale of Two Cities. Here we go. Let's read another one. All children except one grow up. Peter Pan. Yeah. Wow. We'll give it to you. Okay, here we go. It's a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Pride and Prejudice. I'm going to give you one more because this is not going well. Here we go. I scowl with frustration at myself in the mirror. 50 Shades of Grey. Do not pretend, ladies, like you did not know that. Do not pretend like you didn't know that, all right? So you want to capture your readers, you have to have a good opening. But Matthew, he starts out his book, and it's not with a story. It's not with a dramatic opening. It's not with something. It's about looking in a mirror. He starts out with something that is not compelling at all. He starts out with something that really sounds like a Jewish phone book, all right? And he obviously had done some digging around and some research because he presents to his readers, his audience, the genealogy, the family tree of Jesus Christ. All right, this is the ancient version of Ancestry.com. And without question, it is the most boring part of his entire book. So it's understandable that people would see all these names and they just skip right over it. Matter of fact, if I had sent out flyers advertising today's gathering, right, today's service, and maybe taken out billboard and said, on such and such a date, Dave is going to stand in front of a crew of people, and he's going to walk through his family tree, and we invite you to hear about it. Boring. But that's not going to stop me from doing it. So let's walk through my family tree, all right? 1860s. We have here Fred and Bertha. And they, born 1860s, he was a carpenter, she was a homemaker. And apparently they, put some jazz music on in the background, maybe had someone playing live because not long after they were married, they had a son and his name was Fred. And Fred grew up and Fred married Lily. Like his dad, Fred was a carpenter. Lily was a homemaker. And then one day they found out they were pregnant. They were pregnant with a daughter by the name of Edith. That was 91 years ago. So Edith grows up and she marries Vern. And they're from Rice Lake, Wisconsin. Edith was a bookkeeper at one point in her life. Vern was a plumber. And so they ended up having 3 children. One of their daughters was Susan. And Susan, as she grew up, started getting on the dating scene. And you probably know this. She dated Kanye for a little bit. That was just a little bit. I just have to tell you about my parents here, right? So that didn't work out. And so she ended up dating Lenny, and they get married. And Lenny worked at the American Brass in Kenosha, also owned his own tool store, ended up selling that, ended up working for a tool company in Illinois, which he still does. My mom, she was a stay-at-home mom for a while. She did daycare in the house, then she was a teacher, then she was an administrator for a school full-time, and now she's a part-time waitress at the Tilted Kilt. So that is my parents' story. And apparently they didn't have much to do because they ended up having 7 kids, all right? And so this is the family I grew up in. There you go, that's me. And as I got older, and we'll focus on my story because I'm sure you're not interested in hearing the story of my siblings, but I ended up marrying Rindy, and we had, a few kids. Well, here's the deal. I could just keep going on and on and on about my family tree. And you know me, so, maybe for a portion of it you could hang with me, but eventually you'd be like, boring. Move on. And yet Matthew decides, I'm going to start out by telling you, before I even get into the birth of Jesus, I'm going to tell you the family tree. In ancient times, especially in the 1st and 2nd century, the only histories that were written were by hired historians. Okay, these were individuals who had went to school, they had studied ancient history, and most histories were written by people who had been hired by famous generals and military officials and kings and emperors. And so generally speaking, this makes sense. If you are hired by someone to write history, you're going to write history that makes them look a little bit favorable, right? You'll skip over some of their military defeats or downplay them. You'll highlight some of their military victories, because if you're getting paid by someone to write history, you better treat them fairly. And so sometimes in ancient history, we read something and there's gaps in the story, or there's incomplete genealogies, or there's these huge exaggerations, right? There's crimes that aren't talked about. There's certain children who didn't turn out well that you don't even read about them in the story. And so it's just very, very interesting. And I was thinking about this past week, how that really still does happen today in some countries. North Korea, they're notorious for erasing or editing history that doesn't make the leader, right, Kim Jong-un, look good. A few years ago, his uncle, he felt like had betrayed him in some way, or he felt threatened by his uncle. And so he has him assassinated. And then 99% of online documents that had his uncle in there are edited. So you see this one where they move, that's his uncle there. They just kind of move this military official to cover him. They did this with videos. I mean, they're just like, dude, we're going to eliminate this guy's image management. But here's the deal with Matthew. When he writes this manuscript, this historical document detailing the life of Jesus, not only does he list out the genealogy, but he actually seems to go almost out of his way to highlight people that really shouldn't be highlighted. Right? He goes out of his way to talk about people and mention them who we would just assume they should be omitted from the story. And the reason Matthew starts with the genealogy instead of just launching it into a dramatic story about angels and fireworks or whatever the case might be, right? The reason he starts out talking about the genealogy is because he understood his audience. Matthew is writing to a primarily Jewish audience. And he knows that the Jewish people have been waiting on the promised Messiah for thousands of years. And so what he's about to do is present evidence to them that Jesus was the person their prophets had written about on numerous occasions. And the very first question that a Jewish audience is going to ask is this: is Jesus related to King David? Because all Jews believed that Jesus was going to come through the bloodline of King David. Multiple prophets had talked about this. In fact, 600 years before the birth of Jesus, this is what one of the prophets wrote. For the time is coming, says the Lord, when I will raise up a righteous descendant from King David's line. He will be a king who rules with wisdom. He will do what is just and right throughout the land. Okay, so Matthew knew he couldn't prove that if he couldn't prove that Jesus was related to King David, nobody was going to take him seriously. Nobody would consider Jesus to be the promised Messiah. And so he goes through this detailed work of giving us this family tree. But unlike other historians in this time period, Matthew does not give us an edited list. If Matthew is making this stuff up, he would leave certain people out of the story. See, one of the things that makes me actually believe in the authenticity of the documents that we have in our Bible, one of the things that gives me confidence is not what's been left out. It's actually what's put in. Because if you're trying to launch a religion, right, if you're trying to get people to believe this stuff, you're going to be very selective of what you put in. Matthew doesn't seem like he's editing anything at all. I mean, if he's trying to convince his readers that Jesus comes from a Jewish bloodline, he would be dumb to put in any names of people who are not Jewish. If he wants his story to be taken seriously in this very male-dominated culture, he's certainly going to be careful before he lists the name of any women in the story. If there's anybody with a bad reputation, he's going to skip right over them because they kind of work against the plot of convincing people that Jesus is a Messiah. You know, we see this all the time in our culture, right? You got I'll just take politician. It could be any arena of life, but you take a politician, he's going to be careful, or she's going to be careful who they associate with. So they might be friends with a pastor, but if that pastor's controversial, what do? They distance themselves from that pastor, right? I mean, I've done lunch with them or her, right? Right? Same with the CEO. If there's a CEO who ends up being corrupt, but they've been good friends, they downplay the friendship. They downplay the relationship. And that makes sense. This is how our world works. But let me read to you how Matthew starts his writing. And eventually he gets to the birth of Jesus. We're not going to read any of that today. But before he gets to the story of Jesus' birth, he writes out the family tree. Here's what he writes. This is a record of the ancestors of Jesus the Messiah, a descendant of David and of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Now, I wish we had the time to zero in on each of the individuals in this story because it would be very apparent very quickly that these are not flawless individuals. You would think that the family tree that Jesus comes through, right, the bloodline, so to speak, you would think that these would be, people walking around with halos. But even in these first couple of sentences here, Abraham, if we were going to put a label on him, we could label him a liar. Isaac, we could label him divisive because Isaac showed so much favoritism to one of his sons, like my parents do to me. They showed a lot of favoritism. He showed a lot of favoritism to one of his sons, so much so that his brother hated him. And so he was very divisive because of the way he treated his son. Then there's Jacob, right? Jacob, we could label him a deceiver. If you knew anything about his story, he was known for deceiving. Matthew continues, Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. Now this is fascinating to me because Judah has 11 brothers. Every single one of them would be way more qualified to be in the family tree of Jesus than Judah. In fact, his most popular and famous brother is a guy named Joseph, the Technicolor Dreamcoat guy. All right, so that would be like, that would make sense. Judah has a pattern in his life of making destructive decisions, of being deceptive. He has dark moments. He was the guy who actually got his brothers together and kind of led the charge in selling their brother Joseph and then coming up with an elaborate lie to tell their dad. Okay, that was Judah. He's also the guy, and this is going to creep you out, who slept with a prostitute, but because the prostitute had her face covered, he didn't realize it was his daughter-in-law, Tamar. Yeah. And apparently the guy's a sniper because he gets her pregnant on the first try, right? It's like she ends up having twins. Almost any other historian would have eliminated this fact. They would not have mentioned it, but Matthew actually calls it out. Here's what he writes. He says, Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, the one who prostituted herself, the one who knowingly slept with her father-in-law, the one who should have her own reality TV show, that Tamar. And then he continues. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron was the father of Ram. Ram was the father of Amminadab. Amminadab was the father of Nahshon. Nahshon was the father of Salmon. Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Now again, it seems like Matthew is intentionally going out of his way. But whose mother was Rahab? Going out of his way to mention somebody. This time it's Rahab, a non-Jewish woman who has a reputation for being a prostitute. That was her title. All through the different manuscripts that make up our Bible, she is given this title, Rahab the prostitute. Now, not all titles, right? Not all labels are bad. You've got Alexander the Great, Attila the Hun, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But here is Rahab the prostitute. And then Matthew continues. Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Now, from what we know about Ruth, she was actually a good and a godly woman. but she wasn't Jewish. If Matthew's trying to convince the Jewish people that Jesus comes from a pure bloodline of David, why does he bring up these names that seem to be distractions in the story? And he just continues giving us names. And I know it's so easy to get lost, but try to stay with me here. Here's what he writes next. Obed was the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother was Bathsheba, the widow of Uriah. Here we go again. He could have just said, David was the father of Solomon, period. But instead, he points out that Solomon's mother was Bathsheba, and she was the widow of a guy by the name of Uriah, who happened to be King David's best friend or one of his best friends. Now, the reason she was a widow is because King David, who was Solomon's dad, he had an affair with her, with Bathsheba. She got pregnant, but because David didn't want his buddy Uriah to find out, he ultimately came up with a plan to have him killed. Guys, we're only in verse 6. Matthew doesn't even get to Jesus until verse 16. There's almost 1,000 years between King David and the birth of Jesus. And yet Matthew has gone out of his way to create this energy and this interest in these questions related to the birth of Jesus. Why does he do it? Why doesn't he just stick with the good guys? Why doesn't he keep this story clean and sanitary? Here's why I think. Matthew had spent 3 years of his life with Jesus. He had heard the teachings of Jesus, and he had watched who Jesus associated himself with. And it was people with baggage. And it was people with dramatic stories. And it was people with embarrassing stories. And Matthew knew that the people Jesus associated with, and some of the names he references in this genealogy, he knew that they were not just a part of the story he was about to tell. They were the point of the story. This was a story of light coming into darkness. This was a story about forgiveness entering a world that had only known condemnation. This was a story of grace in a world that had been accustomed to just laws. And so Matthew writes down, doesn't even shy away from it, the names of people with embarrassing reputations. And I think part of the reason that Matthew did this is not that he just knew that this was the point of the story, but it was very personal to him. He knew this was his story. His story starts off in a little town called Capernaum, which is just off the Sea of Galilee. And here's what we read about his story. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at his tax collector's booth. So Matthew is a tax collector. He was a Jew, but his job was to work for the oppressive Roman government. And the way he made his salary was by extorting excessive amounts of money from the poorest and most vulnerable Jews. So Matthew's a Jew, and he's ripping off his own people. He is a traitor. He's considered the scum of society. In first century, in fact, you read this all throughout the manuscripts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There were 2 different categories of wrong. There were sinners, and then there were tax collectors. So you would actually see this phrase multiple times in our Bible, sinners and tax collectors. It was like they were a whole separate category of evil. In the first century, they were very wealthy, but again, it was because they ripped off their own people. Here's what we read next. Follow me and be my disciple, Jesus said to him. So Matthew got up and followed him. Apparently, Matthew had heard Jesus teach. He knew enough about him that it wasn't like the first time he's seeing Jesus and he's like, okay, I don't know you, I'm gonna go. No, there's something in him that says, I am compelled to follow Jesus. Then we read this. Later, Matthew invited Jesus and his disciples to his home as dinner guests, along with many tax collectors and other disreputable sinners like Pastor Justin. But when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with such scum? When Jesus heard this, he said, healthy people don't need a doctor, sick people do. Now, if there is an opportunity to get offended, this is it, right? Matthew and his friends ought to get super crazy offended. Because Jesus basically just said, hey, you're sick. But they don't seem to get offended. It's almost like he understands, you know what? Compared to Jesus, yeah, we're sick. We're in need. We need help. And then Jesus continues. He says, I have come to call not those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners. See, Matthew understood the significance of why Jesus was born. He understood that this is a story of God drawing near to those who've drawn away. And so he mentions Judah and Tamar, and he mentions Rahab, and he mentions King David and Bathsheba. Matthew understood that even though our past and our present sin might drive us further from God, it doesn't drive God further from us. And so the story of Christmas is that God actually entered our world so that we would know he's close to us. That's why one of the titles, one of the names given to God is Emmanuel. It means God is with us. And so religion may have told you, including the Christian religion, that you've messed up your life too much, or you've messed up the lives of other people too much. And so now God's angry at you, and he's mad at you, and he's ashamed of you, and he's disappointed in you. Maybe you were told that your infidelity or your lying or your cheating has put you outside of God's love. Maybe you were told that your lust issues, that your divorce, that your sexual orientation put you outside of God's love. Maybe you were told that your drug addiction or your alcohol abuse or the abortions that you have put you outside of God's love. Maybe you were told that your unbelief or your questions or your doubt or your arrogance or your pride or the pregnancy outside of wedlock, or the nasty harm you've done to other people has put you outside of God's love. But what is revealed in the Christmas story and in the life of Jesus and in the death and resurrection of Jesus is there is nothing that puts us outside of the love of God. And so the things that we try to keep secret and hope nobody ever finds out, the dark parts about our life that we're like, man, I just can't have anybody know about this, the deeply embarrassing moments that we just try to keep hidden, those are the very reasons Jesus came, so that we could be truly free. But when we hide these things, when we hope nobody ever finds out, it's easy to miss out on his grace. See, if we hold on to our religion, if we hold on to the messiness of our lives, at some point we're going to miss out on the grace. See, we forget this, right? We picture the crucifixion and we picture evil people there and messy people there. We picture Roman soldiers there and tax collectors there, Bear fans. We picture these people there when Jesus crucified. But there's a whole lot of us who forget that there were also very religious people there. People who were convinced that their behavior made them right with God. People who saw themselves as respectable and blameless. And the truth is this, that the more religious we are, the more difficult it is to accept the fact that I need God's grace on an ongoing basis. And it's only when I embrace my brokenness and become comfortable in my brokenness that I am able to experience the whole point of the Christmas season, the love, the grace, the mercy of God. But I think for a lot of us, grace is like that figgy pudding. We don't really recognize it. Because we, at a certain point, kind of feel like we graduate from our need for God's grace. And so I feel like it is my responsibility as your pastor to every single Christmas have one, sometimes two, sometimes three weeks in a row of where I just talk about you need God's grace. You haven't graduated from it. You need it as badly today as you needed it 5 years ago. I don't care how close you are. I don't care how much you pray. I don't care how much Bible reading you do. The moment you see yourself as kind of me versus them, they need it out there, but I stopped needing it, man, we're missing something. And if there's anybody that I can point to who I believe is such a trophy of God's grace, it's Pastor Marie. She's been a pastor for 29 years, but she's had every reason in the book to not have even been a pastor, not been used by God in the way she's been used. I want you to hear her story.
I had a really normal life with my parents, really talking to me about God and the things of faith, but for some reason I just didn't work for me, and so I kind of went my own way and never really thought about God. But then once I had kids, I had this yearning that I couldn't explain, and over a series of time, I realized that I wanted to follow Jesus. And I'm kind of an all or nothing person, so once I decided to follow him, I was all in. But just to give you a little bit of an idea of my adventure, I was a newly divorced single mom. My baby was only 20 months old. My other two children were 6 and 8. And one time I was praying and God told me in my mind I want you to be a minister. I want you to be a minister. He had to tell me twice because it was so out of the norm. I mean, I was a divorced single mom with 3 children, and I had a degree in medical technology. So of course I should become a minister. So God and I had this tug of war, and I was the only one fighting. He was just very patient with me. And eventually I quit fighting him, and I thought, well, I'm gonna pursue this. So I made a pro and con list, and the con list was really long. And the only thing on the pro list is I wanted to be obedient to what I felt like God was telling me to do. So I went back to school, and then over time I thought, you know what? I think this really might be how God wired me and what I should do. And of course, being a single mom, I had to juggle the kids' schedule and the finances and school and everything. And then I'd have some naysayers who said, you'll never get a job in a church because divorce is the ultimate sin. And I just thought every time, well, God knows what he's doing, I'm gonna follow him. So today is 29 years later, and I have just finished 29 years of vocational ministry, and my title at all the churches has always been pastor. So I worked at 2 churches in Illinois, and then my wonderful son-in-law, he and my daughter and their family come here. He said, why don't you think about Great Lakes Church? And he connected me with Dave, and the rest is history. So I have been at Great Lakes Church now for almost 5 years, and I have to tell you, out of the 3 churches, it's my favorite. And the reason why it's my favorite, I think grace is really lived out here. People are open and vulnerable, and they can totally be safe to struggle with life questions and who God is, and it has just been such a joy. So I've just carried the people of Great Lakes in my heart. Now, I don't want this to sound like a fairy tale, because life has still been hard over those 29 years. There have been things like suicide and divorce and rebellious children and all kinds of issues, layoffs with work and all that. But through the whole thing, God carried me. Because what I found out is every time there's some kind of a crisis, I have a choice. Do I face Jesus or do I turn around? So here I am at Great Lakes, loving it. Everything is just I couldn't be happier here. And then I've been feeling this gnawing for quite a long time that it's time to retire. And instead of being a snowbird that goes to Florida or Arizona, I'm going to be a snowbird, and I'm going to the equator in Africa and work at an orphanage in Tanzania. So my blessing to Great Lakes Church is cherish what you have. Work hard to keep it going. Run to Jesus. He adores you more than you can even imagine. He is there for you morning, noon, and night. He chose you before he laid the foundation of the earth. And you'll always have a friend in me, and I'll be one of Great Lakes Church's biggest cheerleaders.
So God takes a single divorced mom with a lot of heartache and certain experiences that she had gone through in life, no real big formal theological training. She'll admit to you she had a potty mouth in that season of her life. Right? Every excuse why she should never have been a pastor, and yet for 29 years, God's used her. Why? Because that's grace. And here's what I love about Marie. If you talk to Marie about issues that you're going through in your life, and many of you have talked to her, you're never gonna feel like she's condescending or looking down on you, because she still sees, 29 years into this, her own need for God's grace. And so all I wanna say this Christmas season, you wanna experience the magic of Christmas, you wanna experience the feelings of Christmas that we all look forward to, just keep reminding yourself, I need God's grace, I need God's grace, I need God's grace. I was in Cincinnati this past week and had an opportunity to speak at an amazing church, and I I was craving something sweet while I was trying to fall asleep. So I'm trying to fall asleep, and I'm craving something, and I just felt like the Holy Spirit said, go to Big Boy. And so I got up, and I went and got a dessert at Big Boy, And at the end of eating my dessert, a guy and his son come up to my table, and they grab my bill. I had never had this happen before. He just grabbed my bill, and I say, hey, what's going on? He goes, hey, well, I want to get this. And then he turns to the table next to me, and he grabs their bill. Says, guys, I got this. And he proceeded to go to 5 different tables and grab their bill. And the first thing I thought was, I love the people of Cincinnati. You know that's right. And then the second thing I thought was, I wonder if I should tell them I'll be at Ruth's Chris Steakhouse tomorrow night, but I decided not to. All right, here's why I tell you this story. I could have stood up and just said, hey, dude, I'm a grown man. I got a dessert. I can pay for this. Or I could have rejected his offer. Or I could have let him give the gift. And so I just want to let you know, God has given us a gift of salvation. He's given us a gift of forgiveness and gift of mercy. And we can, in our own arrogance, think we don't need it. We can think we graduated past it. We can think we're fine, we behave our way. Or we can every single day reach out and say, God, I'm reminded of why I need this gift of grace. It's up to us. It's a condition of our hearts. But I hope that you'll do. If you've never done that, I just encourage you in your heart of hearts, just say, God, I want to follow you. I want to receive your gift of salvation, and I want to embrace that into my life. Let's stand. I'm going to pray, and then we are dismissed. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your gift of grace. We thank you for your gift of mercy. We thank you that in the family tree of Jesus, we see flawed person and broken individuals and messy lives over and over and over. What an amazing reminder that these people are not just part of the story. This is the point of the story. Help us as we leave here today in the forefront of our mind to be reminded that the point of the story is this human race that includes us. And God, may we never become so arrogant as to think we can reach your standards or our standards by ourselves. We need your love and mercy and forgiveness every day. In Jesus' name, amen.